So I'm here today with Isabelle Groc, and we're talking about her newest book, which is called Sea Otters, A Survival Story. So Isabelle has a few books out. The one that was published just earlier this year is Gone is Gone, and this is the most recent one to come out. She also has a wonderful movie that's about to be released on CBC and has already won awards internationally. But today it's all about sea otters. So Isabelle, thank you for taking the time to speak with everyone about sea otters and their survival story. And maybe you can tell us how this all came about.
Yes, thank you, Cornelia. How did sea otters come about? How did I become interested in sea otters to spend 10 or 12 years of my life working on sea otters? You can tell from my accent, I grew up in France, and although I've lived here in British Columbia for over 20 years ago, and I grew up in a small town really far from the ocean, and yet I had a real passion for the ocean and everything marine related, whales, seals, seabirds, and that's something that was really with me as a little girl. And so when I grew up, I decided I wanted to become a journalist, and more specifically a journalist covering the environment and the plight of endangered species.
So how did that happen? So you were a child in rural France?
Rural France, in the southwest of France.
Not near the ocean.
Not near the ocean. And I think what happened is that when I was about 8 years old, I was watching TV, and suddenly something grabbed my attention. I saw these seabirds that were oiled, covered in oil. And I said, what was going on? What's happening here? And actually it was a time where there was a huge oil spill in France, in Brittany, and it was the most a major oil spill and the first biggest environmental catastrophe to happen in many years, and
probably in your lifetime.
In my lifetime, yeah. And in Brittany, nobody had seen something like that, but it was a real disaster because the coastline were completely covered in oil and seabirds, and so I was watching those images on TV of these poor seabirds being completely hopeless and suffering, and I remember distinctly people on TV saying, we need help, we need volunteers to come and help us clean the shorelines, clean up the shorelines, clean up the birds. And I was just 8 or 10, and I told my parents, I want to go, I want to help the birds. I felt really devastated, even though, remember, I never seen the ocean, I never been to Brittany, I never seen a seabird in my entire life.
Isn't that it? So that was the time. That was like a pivot point in your life.
That was a pivot point. Yes, absolutely. And guess what my parents said to me? No, you're going to stay in school. And my parents have always been very supportive of everything I did afterwards, but at the time, it was not the time to go. And fair enough. But I think at that moment, I became really interested in the idea, okay, well, I want to make a difference. I want to be out there and documenting. And I sort of connected the dots that those journalists, those photographers, they were out there photographing, documenting what was happening, all these environmental disasters, and that made impact. And I thought, well, this is it. I want to become a photojournalist or journalist showing or documenting the plight of endangered species, not just seabirds, but all species. So that's what I did. That took me to Columbia University in New York, where I did my master's degree in journalism, and then I moved to British Columbia, and that was how it happened. I did spend many years following scientists in the field and writing stories for magazine and doing films as well about what people do to understand and help those species in need.
So this has been your life.
That has been my life. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And now you also. I know this has been your life, and you just said 12 years, and the photos in this book are spectacular. Every page has multiple photos on it, and they're absolutely extraordinary. So I can see how you've communicated that so well.
Thank you.
But I know that it's also true that you have another area of expertise, that you studied.
It's true, Cornelia. I also studied urban planning, and that surprises people because usually, as an environmental journalist, people ask me, "What's your background other than journalism? Are you a biologist? Did you study zoology or science?" I say, "No, I haven't. I have a degree in urban planning from MIT." And I go, that's a bit unusual.
Oh, it's wonderful because it doesn't seem to make sense.
No, it doesn't seem to make sense at all, and. Yet, so what I have to explain typically to people is that when I was a journalism student at Columbia University in New York, we were sent in the most, let's say, the inner city neighborhoods at the time in New York that were the forgotten neighborhoods. And they sent us to Harlem, to the South Bronx, and just to tell the stories of the people there that were trying to be heard, to change how they were treated. So I saw a lot of poverty and powerlessness, and also people that were really wanting to make a difference, and that really touched me. And I guess at the time it raised my awareness about wanting to document that, and these people who didn't have a voice, and I wanted to cover that and write about that. And I find out after that, with my passion for telling stories about animals and people who don't have a voice, is pretty much the same thing. It's very connected. And
so the urban planning degree, it would help you sort out and bring more equity, I would think, to the difficulties that you saw when you were traveling around New York. Was that the motivation?
Yeah, that was the motivation, certainly, to again change a difference, make an impact, make things better. And I think I've always been, as a result maybe of that urban planning degree, so I went back to school, did this urban planning degree, so journalism degree, urban planning degree, I became really interested in the interface between people and the natural world, because as I learned, species today are endangered primarily because of human activities, because of habitat loss, because of what we do to the environment and urban development. So, and that creates a lot of conflicts and tensions, is how we all coexist on those spaces.
So as you say that, one of the things that stands out is that one of the things that's so useful for us is that as humans, is that interface, because with the interface, we build an understanding of our relationship with nature, and we are refreshed, we're rejuvenated, we feel better when we're in nature.
Absolutely.
And yet our behavior, the way the interface often happens, isn't helpful to much of nature. So it's, people said to you, do you have a biology degree, do you have this degree or that degree, and yet this is equally important, how to structure the interface of humans and the environment.
I completely agree with you, Cornelia, especially because I think people often tend to, and that's part of our problem of our relationship to nature today, is that we feel we're separate from nature. Nature is something out there that, as you said, we enjoy it, we feel rejuvenated, but we don't see ourselves as part of the system, the ecosystem, and how can we make space for the species around us, and how that actually in turn benefit us as well. So I think certainly the idea of trying to get everyone to consider how we position ourselves and what's our footprint in that overall bigger system is really at the core of everything I've been doing.
Yeah. Absolutely. I can see it as just a very useful tech skill to bring to bear, a lens through which, because we're often wrestling with how do we do good for the environment, and it's often stop everything else, stop everything to do with humans, and yet that's not the solution either, right? So how do we make that interface one that is beneficial for both?
Absolutely, and coexistence, and how can we live together on this shared planet that we seem as human has taken over more and more space, but how can we leave more space for these other species without necessarily feeling or we sacrificing our lifestyle? Actually making room for the species may help us reconsider how we live, especially now in the context of what has happened with COVID-19. So, and to be honest, a lot of the stories I've covered in my career have involved those conflicts that seem to be irreconcilable. So I've looked at how, for example, endangered species like northern spotted owls, when they were listed as endangered, how loggers were very upset, thinking, oh, that's it, we're going to lose our jobs now because the spotted owl, the species that lives in the old growth forest, we can't do our work, we're going to lose our livelihood. So it's often this dimension of people against species, environmental activists versus the people that make a living out of the natural resources. So how do we reconcile those perspectives?
Yeah.
And sea otters certainly brings us at the core of these conflicts. How do we live with those species, and how do we acknowledge that they actually have benefits, and we can all benefit from allowing the species to reclaim their territories.
And that's a big part of this story, is bringing the sea otters back into the West Coast, because they were overhunted and nearly to extinction.
Yeah, and this is why it attracted, the story spoke to me. I've seen in our backyard here in British Columbia, Cornelia, so many species decline in the 20 years I've been here. It's very honestly depressing to see this slide towards extinction. And in the middle of that, here is one species, the sea otter, where we can actually see that species come back. It's a story of hope. It's a story of resilience. It's a story that tells up we can still place a little bit of faith in mankind, that we can turn this around. So you're right, sea otters were hunted to near extinction during the fur trade, because they have beautiful fur, really the thickest, most luxurious fur of all animals in the world, and that was unfortunately their death sentence during the fur trade in the 18th and 19th century. In British Columbia, the last sea otter was shot in 1929, 1931, so that was over. No more sea otters in British Columbia. And then gradually conservationists, scientists thought, well, we should be bringing this species back because it belongs to this landscape. So in BC, they had reintroduction programs in the late 60s, early 70s. They brought back 89 otters from Alaska into the landscape on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And from there, the sea otters, well, they liked what they saw there. They liked the environment. There was lots of food. And so they just expanded. And now there are over 7,000 otters in British Columbia, which is a beautiful story of coming back, that journey from extinction into coming back. Even though it's still a threatened species and there's still issues and threats, it still tells us, it symbolizes to me the impact, the large impacts, positive and negative, that we humans have on wildlife. So
a very strong positive in change. Yes. When I read your book, and this is a book that claims to be for 13 and over, and I have to say, as an adult, I found it an absolute delight to read. And just so much information, so well presented. I sure wouldn't limit it to children. Between the prose and the photos, it was just wonderful. So, and one of the things I learned was how the sea otters being reintroduced just brought that urban balance back into the ecosystem. Like, who knew that one species, which you call a Keystone species, and I'll have you describe that, once they're reintroduced into an area, it actually restabilized so many different species.
Yes, it does, and that's something that wasn't known, which is, again, a lesson learned here of what happens when we remove a species from the ecosystem. All these things happen that you don't know about until you reintroduce the species, and like, oh, things change. So it's really about connected ecosystems and what happens when you remove one species and how it impacts the entire environment. So sea otters indeed are keystone species. That means they have a disproportionate or really important, I should say, it's too hard to pronounce, impact on the environment. So when they come back, and this is something that was particularly interesting for scientists, because they had the opportunity to have almost like a natural laboratory experiment, because they were able to study sea otters in areas where they had come back and areas where they hadn't been there, and compare the marine environment and see what happens when you put a species there, what happens, what changes, and when the species is not there, what happens. So they found that actually because sea otters have a voracious appetite, that's part of their
How much do they eat again?
Oh my God, they eat
huge proportion of their body weight.
25% of the body weight every day.
Every day.
Yeah. Which to me was enough that I could fall in love with these animals, because being French, I'm so obsessed with food that I spend also a lot of my time looking for food. So I love that. I love that about them.